Hi everyone, I hope you are all safe after the storm. I'm recording this video on Friday, October the 11th at about 6 p.m. We just got an email from the administration about an hour ago saying that classes that meet on Mondays should have an asynchronous class with an assignment given to the students, which does not have to be completed on Monday. So your assignment is to watch these videos that I'm making for you because they're about Plato. So here's what we're going to do to adjust our class for the post-hurricane situation. Basically, we're going to keep to the reading schedule that we have laid out on the syllabus, which means that next week, being week 8, we're going to start Plato's dialogue Gorgias. So scratch out week 7 like it never even happened, because essentially it didn't. We just missed 2 assignments. We missed an assignment that was just on Stanley, and then we missed the first in-class essay, of course. That's okay, because what we're going to do is, if you look on the schedule that's in the syllabus, you see during week 12, where I have scheduled the second in-class essay, that's where we'll actually do the first in-class essay. Okay, so we're not going to go straight back into, writing an in-class essay the next time we meet. We're going to go ahead with our reading schedule, and we're going to start Plato. So what I'm going to do in this video is just to give you some general information to introduce you to this particular dialogue of Plato, which I think most of you have not read. Some of you may have read parts of the Republic. Some of you may have read the Apology. Those are the 2 most commonly assigned Platonic texts to read. So I'm going to introduce to you a little bit about this particular Platonic dialogue. In another video, I'm going to talk more specifically about the text. Remember, this is the text that we're using. It's the translation by James Nichols, and I do want you to have a hard copy of it with you. It's not very expensive. I think it's like $10 or so. So have a hard copy. The pages that I'd like you to read for the first stage are, the dialogue begins on page 25. You don't need to read the introduction to the book. You can if you want to, but you don't need to. Start at page 25 is the beginning of the dialogue. Read until through page 44, because this part of the dialogue is the part where Plato is talking with Gorgias, and I'll tell you who Gorgias is in a minute. And then there's a bit of a shift on page 45, so we'll cover that in the next section. So for the first section, read page 25 through the end of page 44, okay? On the next slides, let me tell you about the line numbers. Something you may have noticed in your copy of Plato. There are these little numbers in the margins, right? You see that there? Those are called Stephanic numbers. Because Plato is ancient Greek, there's been so many translations. There's through just literally through the 2.5 centuries that have elapsed since the work was written. So they have devised a way of citing Plato that's unique to Plato. And that's by the use of these line numbers. And so they say line, and usually it encompasses more than one literal line. It's not a poem, even though we're talking about lines and they have line numbers. It's still, don't think of this as a poem. It's a dialogue. Think of it as a play. That's essentially what it is. So the line numbers, you'll notice that they will encompass like several lines. It's almost like a stanza, but we wouldn't call it a stanza. So what you would do if you're in the middle of 2 numbers is you look at the number ahead that came before it, so that, for example, you can just see at the beginning. See, it starts with line 447A. Okay, so anything below that is line 447, even if it's, way down here, several, it's below, it's multiple lines for one line. I know, it's a bit weird. But that's how you cite stuff. And so that's how you find stuff too. So I may say to you, it's on page 27, but then I'll also say it's line 448B. And that's how I would want you to cite it in your papers if we ever get back together to meet in person. That you would need to cite more than just the page number. You would need to cite the actual Stephanic line number. The Stephanic part comes from a particular translation that was done back in the Middle Ages, I think. That was the person's name who did the translation. It might have been into Latin or something, but anyway, obviously it's been translated into not just many translations in English, but many translations in Latin and just about every other language. So that's why we go by line numbers to tell people, where exactly we're talking about in the text, because there's no chapters, of course. Okay, so those are the line numbers. What I'm going to do in this video is introduce you to the characters on the next slide and tell you a little bit about the setting. And then I want to tell you about this larger idea that Socrates is talking about in this dialogue that I want you to keep in mind as we read. And that is the difference between rhetoric on the one hand and philosophy on the other, or what he'll call it the dialectic. It's essentially philosophy. I'll explain, as means of getting at truth. So we have two ways of getting at truth that are presented here. One is via rhetoric and the other is via the dialectic. So I'll explain more about what that means later on in this video. But that's like one of the larger ideas in the text overall. I'm going to make another video that will be more specific to those first pages that I've assigned, pages 25 through 44. I'll make another video that will talk more specifically about the ideas that are just in those pages. But consider this video the introduction to the dialogue, to the Gorgias as a whole, okay? So I'll say more on the next slide. Okay, so who's who in this dialogue and what is the setting? The first question is very easy. There's 5 people, only 5 characters in this dialogue. Those characters are Socrates, of course, who is an unconventional philosopher living in the 5th century BC in Athens. Socrates' friend Cepharon. Cepharon is a follower of Socrates, a lover of philosophical conversations. You'll notice in the first few lines, Socrates blames Cepharon for making them late to the event because he was hanging out talking in the agora too much. As you know from the modules, I put a little explanation of what the agora is. It's like the marketplace, but the marketplace was also the place where people hung out and had philosophical conversations or debated things, since they had a kind of democracy going on, right? So Cepharon likes to talk too much, basically. So he makes them late to the event that they're headed to. I'll explain about what that event is in a minute. And then the last 3 characters, in addition to Socrates and Cepharon, you have Callicles, Gorgias, and Gorgias' student Polus. So Callicles is another philosopher, a philosopher like Socrates, but he's a more conventional one. Socrates is a very unconventional philosopher, right? As you know, he was sentenced to death for corrupting the youth, forced to drink the hemlock. So Socrates is a real, gadfly. He's a real agitator, Callicles is also a philosopher, but he's much more conventional. Gorgias is a sophist. Now, a sophist is an itinerant teacher of rhetoric. So he goes around and teaches people how to use words to manipulate other people. So he's, in other words, I guess we could call him a propagandist. You know what we really should call him, though? The best word that we have is Gorgias is an influencer. Exactly. Like I'd love to see Gorgias on TikTok. He's an influencer, and just like many influencers, he can teach you how to be an influencer. That's what Gorgias is. So he's a sophist who teaches you how to influence other people, right? He lived roughly the same time period as Socrates. A little longer, I guess. Anyway, and then there's Polus, who is Gorgias' student. Now, the thing I want you to keep in mind is kind of divide them up in your head on that way. Like, you have Socrates and Cepharon on the one hand, and then you have Callicles, Gorgias, and Polus on the other. The reason I say to keep them together is because they will all argue kind of the same point, which is the conventional point of view, against Socrates, who is going to slowly and methodically point out the logical inconsistencies in that conventional point of view. So one thing to notice is that even though the play is called Gorgias, actually Gorgias does not do most of the speaking in this dialogue. Now the first part, the part that I've assigned you to read for today, pages 25 through 44, he is the main other person who's talking with Socrates. But then we break on page 44 because Polus takes over from there. And then eventually Callicles will take over from Polus. But all three of them will be arguing just the conventional thinking of the day, right? And Socrates will eventually, slowly, very kindly and nicely and, with much grace, point out their logical inconsistencies. That even though he does it with a lot of grace, it doesn't avoid annoying these people. So, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, so in the beginning, so the setting is that they were on their way to an event, and that event was to hear Gorgias, the sophist, demonstrate his skill as a teacher of rhetoric. So this is how Gorgias earns his living. Sophists go around and they teach people how to influence other people, just like the influencer on TikTok. If you want them to teach you how to make money like they did using TikTok to influence people, you have to pay them some kind of fee. Right. So Gorgias does the same thing. People pay him to be his student so that they can learn from him how to use rhetoric to influence people. So Socrates and Cepharon were on their way to this event where Gorgias is demonstrating his skill and trying to gain new students, but they're late and they miss it. Callicles jumps in though and says, hey, no worries, Gorgias is staying at my house, you can come over, ask him all the questions you want. Okay, so that's the setting that the dialogue opens in. And the very first question you might be tempted to skip over because it seems so obvious, but don't. The very first question that Gorgias is asked is who he is. It's Cepharon who asks it. Cepharon asks Socrates, well, what should I ask him? And Socrates says, ask him who he is. And Cepharon says, well, what do you mean? Tell me more. Because, it's obviously, like, we know the guy's name is Gorgias. What is it you want me to ask him who he is? Why? And Socrates explains that, like, okay, well, if you were a person who makes shoes and somebody asked you who you were, you would say, I'm a cobbler, right? That's what I mean. So he means to ask him who he is by asking about what it is he does every day, what it is he practices, right? Now that, of course, it means he's going to ask him what to define rhetorician, but think about that beforehand, because this is going to come up again and again. What is it that you do? Because what you do defines who you are. This is a very old idea. It's I think it's pretty universal because it's found not only in the history of Western thought, but it's also in many Eastern religions, right? You are what you practice every day. And Western religions. So, for example, you meditate every day, and that's what makes you a Buddhist. You pray every day. That's what makes you a good Christian or a good Muslim. It's these practices, the things that you do every day become part of who you are, right? So think about that whenever you hear them talking about experience, because later on, after Gorgias does a terrible job of defining rhetoric, and they all turn to him and say, okay, Socrates, so how do you define rhetoric? Socrates' answer is going to be that rhetoric is not an art, but an experience. There's that word again, experience. So remember, when you get to that point, which is at the end, it's going to be in the next class periods reading. It's on page 45. At that point, remember about what the whole premise is, the whole underlying assumption is here. The assumption is that you are what you do. And the very first question, the very first thing Socrates wants to know of Gorgias is, who are you? What do you do every day? And then, of course, the idea is he's defining rhetorician. So that leads me to another main point that you should keep in mind. Ancient Greeks philosophy, it's always, always, always about getting at their main goal is to understand the nature of things. That's it. The nature of things. What is the nature of this pen? What is the nature of truth? What is the nature of justice? What is the nature of beauty? In Plato's Republic, he proposes the forms, right? You may have heard that term, Plato's forms, the essential forms of things. What is that quintessential thing that makes something what it is and nothing else? There's a unique way Socrates has of talking about it in this dialogue. He says, what in the world is the thing? Say, Gorgias, what in the world is rhetoric? What in the world? That phrase, what in the world it is another way of saying, what is its nature? What is its essential nature? So there's this underlying assumption in ancient Greek philosophy that everything has an essential nature. This spoon has an essential nature. It's the spoonness. It has spoonness, right? The phone has phoneness. The pen has penness. Justice has justiceness. Everything has this essentialness to it that is permanent and unchanging and universal. And that's what makes that thing. Okay? So this is a really important idea. And this is why Socrates is asking Gorgias over and over again, what is this thing you call rhetoric? What is its nature? What kind of thing is it in the world? And he's going to compare it to, many other things. And he's going to use this word art. So that's another thing I want to talk to you about a little bit, is that he's going to say, what is the art which the rhetorician is skilled at practicing? What kind of art is it? So that word art, there's a footnote in the text, it's the word techne. It means skill, knowledge. We've already used it in this class, haven't we? We've already encountered it in Jacques Ellul. Technique, techne, the one efficient way to do something, right? For the ancient Greeks, art or techne, it's like expert skill, knowledge. It's the ultimate knowledge, essential knowledge. So it's art in the sense of a fine thing or the best thing, the essential thing. So that idea of what art is, it's related to that idea of what the essence of a thing is, right? So think about the art of medicine, the art of gymnastics. Those are two examples that Socrates gives, right? So if the doctor has knowledge of medicine, he knows the art of medicine, right? If the rhetorician has knowledge of what, then he's a rhetorician, right? So that's what Socrates is trying to fill in the blank there. What is it that the rhetorician has knowledge of, right? And eventually Gorgias's answer is going to be that it's persuasion. It teaches persuasion. The rhetorician teaches people how to persuade other people, particularly in the political arena, right? So this has been the first part of the dialogue. Notice that part where Gorgias eventually makes this explicit connection between rhetoric and politics. It's on page 33, okay? So about line 452D. See how I've cited it here? That's the part where Gorgias makes rhetoric explicit to the political arena. That's what its use is for. Okay, so as we go through this dialogue, and Gorgias is trying to define what this thing called rhetoric is, what its nature is, what its essential being is. Eventually, what we're going to see Socrates do, not in this first section that I've assigned yet, but eventually, we're going to see Socrates contrast that method, he's going to call rhetoric as a method of finding out the truth, with another way of finding out the truth, which he calls the dialectic. Okay, so on the next slide, I'm going to say a little bit more about the Socratic method, the dialectic, and what that means, and how Socrates contrasts the dialectic with rhetoric. And he says these are two very different ways, and rhetoric is not going to lead you to the truth. Only philosophy does that. Okay, so I'll say more on the next slide. Okay, so the dialectic, my definition of it is this. The dialectic is a participatory act of discovering the truth via conversation. Okay, each word in that definition is important. Participatory, discovering, and conversation, right? Okay, so a Platonic dialogue is what they call an elenchus, or elenchus, I forget how to pronounce it. It's an elenchus is a back and forth exchange, a give and a take. That's what an elenchus is, right? Socrates says one thing, his opponent says another. Socrates says this then, and then the opponent says that, and then Socrates builds off of that. You see how it goes back and forth? It's a process. So it's not a lecture. And so we could call this, what I'm describing, the Socratic method. He said this is how you get at the truth. And it's a means of gaining knowledge rather than belief, as he'll prove in the first few pages that rhetoric is a way of getting at belief, but belief is not the same as knowledge. To get at knowledge, you need to use the dialectic, this give and take participatory, so both sides, two people equally participating. Unlike propaganda, which, remember, again, another reference to Jacques Ellul, propaganda is a one-way street. It's a top-down. It's not a give and take exchange between equals. Because if it's propaganda, then one person has all the information and they're trying to manipulate the other person, right? So it's not an exchange between equals. It's an inherently unequal thing. That's as opposed to the dialectic, which is a participatory act of discovering the truth via conversation. So you may have also heard the dialectic described as this way. This plus that equals some new thing, right? It's a synthesis. So you have thesis, and then you have antithesis, equaling a new synthesis of the two. So that's another way of putting it. But it's a building off of one thing from another thing, okay? Now, here's an interesting thing that I learned in my studies. There's another word that Socrates used to describe this method. This is a method. This is the Socratic method. It's a means of getting at the truth. In other words, it's a process. It's how you go about doing something, right? And this other word was the maieutic, or maieutic. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. It's a Greek word, ancient Greek word for midwife. It's a Greek word for midwife, the maieutic. And that refers to the method of teaching designed to bring to light wisdom that was already present, but not yet birthed. Okay? So already present, meaning, in the analogy here, the philosopher using the dialectic does not create the truth. The truth is already there. The baby's already there. The philosopher is the midwife helping to bring the baby into being. You see? So it's a birthing process. There's this image of, giving birth to the truth. The truth is already there. You're just going to help bring it into the world, bring it into the light for everyone to see. That's the philosopher's job. Okay? So what Socrates does in this dialogue of Plato's is to show how this dialectic process is very, very different from what the sophists teach, from the art of persuasion. These are two separate things. He makes this is the overwhelming point of the Gorgias dialogue, is that you have rhetoric on one hand, the art of persuading people via manipulating them by words that can only lead them to belief, not to true knowledge. To get to true knowledge, you have to use dialectic, which is you have to use philosophy. Okay, so I hope this was a good overview of some of the main ideas. I may be able to make or add one more slide that's more specific to the stuff that's in the first 25 pages, but we'll see how it goes. So your assignment for Monday's class is to watch this video. Of course, take notes, just like I would be, telling you, reminding you in class. Take notes on this video. Write this stuff down. If I put it up on the slide, it's important. And go back and forth. Use this text. Underline stuff in the text like I have done. Everywhere they talk about art, I've underlined it in orange. I've marked where they talk about politics. I've marked, here's this section where Gorgias is describing the power of rhetoric. I just write it in the margins there so that I can find it. Because you can't skim Plato. It doesn't work. It's really hard to find things in Plato. So you're definitely going to want to mark up the book. That's why I wanted you to have a physical copy. In case I forgot to mention this in the first slide, I have recently discovered that there's a cheap audiobook version that you might want to use in addition to the textbook, not as a supplement to. Okay, it's in addition to, it's as a supplement to, not as a replacement of. Sorry, I misspoke. It costs $7. I got it on audible.com, and it's a dramatic reading of the dialogue. Now, it's not reading this exact text. So it will take you some time to find, oh, they said that in the audiobook version. Where is that here? It will take you some time to find it because it's not a word for word translation. They're not reading literally James H. Nichols's translation word for word, but they are sometimes they're phrased things in a way that will make a little bit more sense to you, so it might help you to get the overall point of what they're talking about. But you you can't rely on that. You're going to need the actual book to use in class, to cite in class. Okay. So I hope that helps. And I will be in touch as soon as I know any more about Tampa campus. The university will send out an update and we'll figure out when we meet next. But for now, Plato's Gorgias. I will see you in the interwebs. All right. Bye, you all.